in the context of systems change, narrative itself is a system. And at its simplest definition, narratives are the deeply held beliefs that shape the ways that people interpret and construct the world.
It's easy to say the nonprofit sector is broken. Less easy is saying how we're going to fix it. Welcome to What Donors Want, a podcast by IG Advisors, where we speak with brilliant people to reimagine the future of social impact. In this fourth season, we'll be switching things up a bit and diving into what we all want, including and beyond donors. I'm Rachel Stephenson-Sheff, IG's Managing Director, and we're a strategy consultancy specializing in social and environmental change. This podcast is part of our mission to fix the flow of resources for good. Welcome back to What Donors Want. I'm Rachel, IG's Managing Director.
And I'm Emily, IG's CEO. Today we're exploring the concept of narrative ecosystems with Mandy Van Deven and Jody Myrum.
Before we dive in, a big thank you and shout out to our official Season 4 sponsor, Siegel Family Foundation, whose generosity and partnership makes this all possible. Also a big shout out to our fantastic media partner, Alliance Magazine. Check out their website, alliancemagazine.org, and you can get 50% off a subscription with the code WhatDonorsWant, all one word, at checkout. All right, on to the conversation with Mandy and Jody. Really hope you enjoy it. Okay, welcome, Mandy and Jody, to What Donors Want. Thank you so much for joining us today and for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
So before we dive in to everything that we're going to talk about today, I just wanted to start with a few introductions. If you wouldn't mind just introducing yourselves to listeners, your work, where you're affiliated, where you come from, and then we can dive into it.
Yeah, so this is Mandy, and my very incomplete version of my story is that I grew up in the US South in a working class single parent household where the questions about the injustices that I witnessed and experienced in the world were often dismissed with a kind of resignation that life's not fair. So when I got to college and discovered things like queer theory and Black feminism and class critique, I grew absolutely smitten and immediately got involved in grassroots organizing. And so while I was a community organizer working at the intersection of gender, racial, and economic justice by day, I was also organizing indie film festivals and music events and publishing a magazine about art and activism by night. And I often tell people that I didn't have the luxury of living a linear life. And so my professional journey is a reflection of that, because along the way, I also made a living as a journalist, as working in advocacy communications, and then as a grant maker where I resourced the communications and narrative infrastructure of global justice movements. And then to bring us kind of into the present, I moved to the Netherlands nearly 4 years ago and founded Both And Solutions, which is a global consulting collective that draws on the professional expertise and lived experience of people in order to provide strategic guidance to individual wealth holders and philanthropic institutions. And it was through this work that I also began facilitating the emergence of a community of practice called Elemental, which enables funders to cultivate the conditions in philanthropy to resource narrative power.
Mandy, when do you sleep?
At night, just like everybody else.
Brilliant intro and brilliant answer.
Yeah, amazing. That's what we call IG a squiggly career, where you collect all of the different tools and resources and experiences you need to be a kind of profound advisor and weave it all together.
I love that.
Yeah,
it's very Jeremy Bearimy. I don't know if you watch The Good Place, and that's really okay. Never mind. If any listener watches The Good Place, they will understand the reference.
We always love a deep cut reference.
Yeah, it's that was really very moving. Thank you for sharing that. Really, really important and amazing work. So Jody, over to you.
Hi, yes, this is Jody, and excited to be on this podcast and excited to be on this with Mandy. Our paths in the squiggly wiggly pathway have merged a few times, or many times over the years, for probably a decade now. So excited to be in this conversation with her and with both of you. And I guess in the spirit of sharing a bit about the beginning, I started as a youth organizer when I was a teenager. This really led me, and what I experienced and when I witnessed during that time led me to working with girls very deeply. And most of my work over the years, though it has been kind of a harder, unpredictable or squiggly path, has been really grounded in moving resources and power to girls and young feminists. So kind of coming out of youth organizing, I started working with girls directly, and for a long time as a youth worker and in direct services with systems involve girls in the US, with girls in many parts of the world, across West Africa. I worked in humanitarian contexts in Eastern Africa and the Horn of Africa. So there's a long history of working directly with girls and young feminists around power building, around supporting them in their activism, around working directly with survivors of sexual violence and state violence and beyond, and then transitioned into a role in philanthropy and led the largest initiative focused on adolescent girls and young feminists for a decade. And I think it's a lot of my kind of thinking around, though I think about narrative and think about stories being a part of my work from the very beginning, a lot of my understanding and shaping around what that meant and the impact of narrative on kind of decision makers and culture more broadly came kind of during that transition. So yeah, that leads to where I am now. I transitioned out of philanthropy in 2020, and like Mandy, I wear a number of hats. I consult with funders and organizations. I also co-lead the With and For Girls Collective, which is a donor organizing space focused on moving more and better resources to girls and young feminists. And over the past few years, I've been co-creating and now have launched our collective practice, which is focused on building narrative, knowledge, and power within For Girls. So we serve as a hub for learning, experimentation, and collaboration to foster an ecosystem that is accountable to girls and a world where girls can live in safety, dignity, and freedom, and see narrative as a critical strategy for achieving that.
This is a beautiful full circle moment for us, because we at IG were involved in the very beginnings of the With and For Girl Collective. So it's amazing to hear where things are at, and that kind of the extra nuance that you're bringing to everything that girls need and how they can be involved. And I also love how both of you have kind of already embodied a little bit of what we're here to talk about. We've had the narrative of your whole journey, right? You're not just talking about your current job titles. You're giving us that kind of journey and that important grounding in where you've come from and what you've learned, and the kind of circuitous route that you've taken here. And so you've done a lot of work around narrative ecosystems in philanthropy, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So to kick us off on that, can you first define that term, narrative ecosystems? What is a narrative ecosystem, and why is this important?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I'm sure that many people have been hearing about narrative change, especially since it's become something of a buzzword in philanthropy over the last decade or so. And the truth is that whenever something becomes the topic du jour in philanthropy, it immediately starts to get kind of co-opted and redefined both by funders and folks in the field. And this, of course, can be quite confusing for folks who are trying to find their way into a new area of work. And then it's also a bit frustrating for folks who are trying to, maintain the integrity of a field that they've worked in for a long time. So it's actually really critical to ask people to be clear about what they believe narrative to be, so that you're on the same page when you're having those conversations and trying to figure out how you might work together. And so I think the place that I'll start is by saying that in the context of systems change, narrative itself is a system. And at its simplest definition, narratives are the deeply held beliefs that shape the ways that people interpret and construct the world. And since that's a bit conceptual, I'll give you an example of what that actually looks like. So at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, we all witnessed and lived through a multi-system failure, where everything from healthcare to the education system to supply chains fell into disarray. And in that moment, something else that was happening is that we saw the destabilization of a lot of long entrenched narratives and beliefs around personal responsibility or safety or racial equity. And those things kind of unraveled because people saw the ways that those narratives were false. And they were compelled to question why they had believed those things in the first place. And so this opened the door for organizers and other people who are trusted by the communities that they live and work in to propose different ways of understanding and redesigning what the world ought to be. And those narratives included things like our well-being is tied to one another, or good governance prioritizes people over profits, or we have the power to keep our communities safe. And that when we unite across differences and work together, that there is enough for all of us. And so what we've seen in that time, so over the last 4 years or so, is that these narratives about care and abundance have been proliferating. And that wasn't an accident, right? It was because there were collective formations or narrative ecosystems that were able to quickly co-strategize, share information, mobilize themselves and others in ways where groups weren't just saying the right things, they were also engaging in solidarity actions that literally saved lives, right? And so to put that a slightly different way, it means that their actions spoke just as loudly as their words. And something that people often say, particularly who are doing narrative organizing, is that narrative change is a fundamentally collective endeavor that requires a broad set of actors to work together over a significant period of time to advance a shared vision. And so what that means is that no one organization is going to be able to make narrative change alone. And frankly, no one funder is going to be able to do that either. So when we think about what it takes to resource this work at scale, what we have to think about is how do we work together ourselves? And at the same time, how do we enable a diverse set of actors to do the same? And that means taking an ecosystem approach to who and what we're funding and operating in collaborative ways where our grant making is strategically aligned, and so that what we're doing is actually more than the sum of our parts.
So just to summarize on some of that, or try to, and you tell me if I've got it wrong. So I think that it's one of those things that has some really kind of beautiful simplicity at the core of it, but actually can feel quite conceptually complex. And I love your use of the pandemic as the example, because of course that was so relevant and touched all of our lives in different ways. But to kind of zoom out to almost a more generic example, a narrative ecosystem around a shared progressive goal in society, something that we want everybody to, or as many people as possible, a tipping point worth of people as possible to understand and embody and kind of use in policy, something that we want to change in the world. A narrative ecosystem in support of that would be a collection of actors that believe in that thing, or can all agree that they believe in that kind of shared vision, working and using storytelling, communications, narrative tools to proliferate messages and conceptual frameworks that then take on a life of their own and kind of really seed themselves in our kind of broader mindset as a society, so that they can then be embodied outside of that kind of core group that have done the work of thinking about the right messages and how to craft them. Is that right? Have I kind of understood that correctly?
I think that you've understood it correctly on a broad scale. The one sort of modification that I would make is that piece around messages. Because when we're talking about narrative, it's necessarily decentralized work that people take on themselves in different ways. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we're all speaking in the same way. It does mean that we have the same shared vision and the same shared set of beliefs, but the ways that that is spoken into the world may be very different and should be determined by the people who are doing that speaking.
So the work is in that core of kind of that shared vision, and then the kind of almost like creative communications work is happening in like an outer layer that really understands their communities and the kind of the role that they play in sharing messaging in that vision with the people that it's relevant for. Is that right?
And I think it starts with, and what's really important, and I think what Mandy landed on is with it needs to be rooted in those who are kind of most impacted by systems of injustice, right? Is that it's the messages, it's the communications, and it's also like where the stories are coming from and power building strategies within communities to collect those stories and to really drive the narrative. And then, I love the way that Bridget Evans from Pop Culture Collaborative talks about this idea of kind of that we're swimming in oceans of narratives, and like fish don't know they're swimming in water. We don't know that we're constantly interacting with narratives that influence everything about how we understand and think about ourselves and the world and how we make decisions at every level. And the reason why I always think that's helpful in thinking about this question of ecosystem is the amount of immersion, the amount that it requires us to actually create that shift. And that's where this idea that a singular campaign or organization or movement can't get to that long-scaled kind of shift in what we believe as collective common sense. So that's always helpful for me to think about it in this, like, what are all of the different inputs we're getting all the time that we don't even know about, and how do you counter those? And that's why it requires so much of a broad ecosystem to be able to replace those narratives.
Yeah.
This podcast is made possible by Seagull Family Foundation. We are building an extensive network of extraordinary people, positively transforming lives and communities across Africa. Whether you're a dreamer, funder, leader, or visionary, our network can help you make the greatest impact. To learn more, visit www.seagullfamilyfoundation.org or contact us at info@seagullfamilyfoundation.org.
This is really, and it's absolutely fascinating within the philanthropy world and beyond. And we're going to get to the philanthropy part of this in a second. But something that it's really reminding me of that I want to share, to make sure it's also correct conceptually, but also in case any listeners relate to this. There's the book Sapiens that was released several years ago. It was like a big book that was in every airport, like on the front of every bookstore, by someone named Yuval Noah Harari, and he's this incredible anthropologist, historian. And it was basically the history of Homo sapiens. And one of the things that stuck with me most from reading that was the idea of what has enabled Homo sapiens to rise to the top of the ecosystem, essentially. And there was a few elements like the domestication of fire and some of those more practical pieces. But one of the core things that he said enabled humans to get to where we are now is the concept of fiction. That's the word he used. He didn't use narrative, but the concept of fiction, of inventing collective fictions that we buy into and can organize around. And so some of the things that he was talking about was money, obviously relevant to philanthropy, is that money is in of itself a fiction. The value that we ascribe to money doesn't actually have any inherent value, and nowadays it's just a number on a screen. And yet we buy into the fiction of that, into the fiction of economic systems, of religious systems, of gender, of like everything is a fiction. And I really like that word. I know it's closely related to narrative. Of course, it's, I suppose narrative could be nonfiction too if we want to get too deep. But what I like about it is that it has so much scope for change. Is that, we can change a narrative, we can change a story, and a fiction is just a fiction, and it can be
a set of beliefs.
It's a set of beliefs, exactly. And there's something about the word fiction I like because it's subjective in its nature, in its very nature. And I think that's what's so cool about the work you do is that, we had the scope for so much deep transformative change. And as you said, narrative is a system. It's part of systems change. And I find that really exciting. So I share that in case there's any other Sapien readers listening, because I know I devoured that book in like
Which
one
is saying
day.
something because it's a proper doorstep.
It's absolutely massive, but it was mind-blowing. So I do recommend it. But, or I should say, and now let's get into philanthropy and narrative. Because I think now I really do understand what we're talking about here. So, which is good. Hopefully let's go deeper. But I think it's important because, we don't want to be jargony. We want to be real about what this means. And there's so many interesting ways I can see the role of philanthropy supporting narrative work, and you've written very extensively about this. And Jody, you mentioned With and For Girls, and how, how that's even a kind of narrative infrastructure support. And so I'm wondering, in the context of philanthropy and the funding system, the fiction of the funding system, if we will, can you elaborate on the role of philanthropy in supporting narrative ecosystems? How do these two things intersect?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's our collective practice that's really working and centered in supporting narrative change within the girls ecosystem alongside incredible partners like the With and For Girls Collective and many, many, many others. And that is, I think, the beauty of that ecosystem, right? When we think about ecosystem as the different coordination bodies, the different places that are kind of collectively sharing a vision. And in that case, with the With and For Girls Collective, how do we move resources and power to girls and young feminists? So yeah, I think philanthropy, and I'll kind of share a little bit about, I think that relates to the conversation of the ecosystem as well, but philanthropy can play a really critical role in supporting narrative infrastructure when it is done in right relationship with movements and organizers, and when funders understand their role in this ecosystem. And I think Mandy started to allude to this earlier, that the co-optation that can happen when something becomes popular, or the thing that people are suddenly talking about. And so it's really important just to start with naming that funders should see their role as resource stewards who are supporting efforts being led in communities most impacted by injustice, those leading movements and those organizing on the front lines, those working to build power and build narratives based on the stories they want to tell and the narratives they want to exist. So it's really important that funders see themselves in that role as moving resources, and then start to look at what their role can actually be. So I think I'll come back to this question of the role and how funders can support narrative infrastructure. I think just to put a fine point on co-option and kind of what happens when funders step into a space and get confused on their role, I can share an example from the girls space. And that's about, some of you, if you were in this space then. So 15 years ago, we started to see a lot more attention on girls on the surface. This is a good thing, right? Girls are on the agenda. They were being talked about in rooms filled with people in positions of power. And suddenly girls were showing up on panels. That was a requirement in many spaces, which is problematic and good and complicated in a whole nother podcast. But when you looked more closely at this trend, something was not adding up. And that was, well, girls were being talked about, the stories being told about girls, and therefore the narrative starting to emerge did not reflect their lived experiences. So girls and their allies working with them in communities and movements were not the one controlling the stories or the narratives about them. And instead, the agenda and the narratives underpinning that agenda were being driven by philanthropy and were deeply disconnected from girls' social and political contexts. So while there's more attention on girls, resources were not reaching the incredible work happening by, with, and for girls in many corners of the world. And that work is deeply politicized. It's building girls' power. It's addressing the structural barriers facing girls and the brave and creative strategies girls were and are bringing to all sorts of social movements around the world, where they're sparking and leading and participating in change, but that's not who is receiving any money. Instead, a technical field emerged, and INGOs were able to raise money on the backs of girls and build programs for girls, but those programs didn't reflect the political work girls were doing, and the resources weren't reaching those who are already doing the important critical work on the ground. So I wanted to share that as an example because I think it's an important one, and there's some lessons that we can pull from that to the broader narrative field. One, kind of narratives and how to change them needs to be driven by those most harmed by injustice, not by those holding the purse strings. Otherwise, while intentions might be good, there's unintended consequences of derailing the work of social movements and other narrative practitioners and beyond in the space. And then I think another kind of cautionary there is we cannot fund narrative work as a technical field disconnected from movements and organizing. It's a really critical strategy and a part of organizing and a part of movements among a set of strategies. And another thing that happens when philanthropy comes in with resources and kind of agenda setting and doesn't connect with movements or isn't driven by movements in the agenda and work that they're setting is, it creates space and emergence for other things to kind of swoop in that are also disconnected from movements. So I think that's just one example I wanted to share to really get at the importance of making sure that funders are in the role of resource stewards. And then, yeah, they can play a really important role, in making sustained contributions to narrative power building across generations. We're talking about, as we said in the last segment, fundamentally changing what people believe, how they think, the fabric of our culture that drives how people make every decision in their life. And this will not happen in a 3-year grant cycle. It will not happen in a programmatic framework. So we need to be providing the sustained resources for people to be funding over a long time. And then funding really needs to be flexible, not short term. People need to be, and not only at moments of crisis. I think the other thing we often see in philanthropy is that as soon as a crisis hits or there's a horrific tragedy, resources pull in, come together. But too often it's too late to really get ahead of the narratives that conservative folks are putting forward. So and we need to be resourcing movements so they can hold the line and have the ability to respond to crisis. And then we already talked about the importance of funding an ecosystem, but just one other piece there that's really important in resourcing an ecosystem is that when resources come to a place, if it's not done with care and in right relationship, it can create tension and unnecessary competition in an ecosystem where really what we need to be doing is fostering collaboration in order to build our collective power. So that is some of what I will share on that. And I'll hand over to Mandy to see if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I guess what I would like to add to that is that, Jody and I recently attended a global gathering of narrative practitioners and funders that was organized by Iris Puentes and the Global Narrative Hive. And at that gathering, narrative practitioners shared their knowledge about the type of work that philanthropy has largely overlooked, and also indicated what their priorities are and what needs funding. And so I think that it's important to lift some of those up. And some of them were spaces and spaciousness that really enable deep listening and durable relationship building. So this speaks a bit to what Jody just said about the decreasing the propensity for competition that will happen when something starts to get funded. They named the need for ways to collectively engage in visioning and imagining what their shared North Star is. They talked about being able to collaborate across strategies, countries, regions, issues, identities, basically ways to deliberately break down these arbitrary silos that are created by funding streams, but that don't actually reflect both the realities of how movements operate or the realities of how people live, right? They talked about wanting to, have resources for practices that cultivate healing and solidarity, for engaging in ways that emphasize how the work is done rather than what it produces. There's a lot of funders now that are funding in the sort of narrative space or strategic communications that may fund a campaign, they may fund like art projects, they may fund films, these kinds of things that are kind of tangible, but that really overlooks the value of the process itself and the methodology itself. And then they also talked about needing funding for approaches that are experimental and that don't have predetermined agendas or outcomes. And I think that really speaks to the fact that narrative change is not something that you engineer. And that is something that is deeply outside of current philanthropic practice. And so when you look around the philanthropic sector, there are very few funders that are operating in the ways that narrative practitioners actually need them to be operating. And yet there are many individuals, organizations, decentralized networks all over the world that are doing incredible work on narrative. And that's because money is not the only resource, right? There's gumption, there's resilience, there's knowledge, there's relationships. And these are the things that are often unrecognized as really meaningful parts of resourcing this work and powering what narrative change looks like. So I just want us to also kind of think more broadly when we're talking about resourcing, about what it is that we mean by resources, because money is not the only thing of value for either philanthropy to be putting in or that's already in the work.
That is, everything you've shared is so fascinating. And thank you as well for sharing that example with the panel with and for girls, because I think it's so important to bring that into the specifics. And Mandy, what you just said around even the word resources being a multidimensional narrative in and of itself, funding this kind of work. And I just wanted something that's really I'm very struck by is how this is happening, whether we're aware of it or not. Even Jody, what you said earlier about being the fish in water that doesn't know you're swimming in water, because we are so immersed in these narrative ecosystems and in the fictions and the narratives that we absorb as people, as a society. And so it strikes me as well when you talk about philanthropy that there's a real degree of intentionality there, because whether or not there's a narrative around, even if you are a funder that doesn't identify as a narrative funder or even a systems change funder, you're just giving your grants to the organizations that you love and trust, and and that's okay. Whether or not you're even conceptualizing your role in the system as one of narrative influence, you are, by definition of your resources and who you're giving to and the work and perspectives they're championing out in the world, you are supporting some sort of narrative ecosystem, right? Right. Okay. Seeing some nods. That's good. So I think that I'm very struck by, because I could imagine a funder listening to this going, oh, that sounds really interesting, but I don't really, I'm not sure I would use those words to describe my own practice. And I feel like what you're saying is that this actually applies to everyone, whether you know it or not. And you're supporting some sort of narrative, whether or not you're doing that intentionally. And so even strategically, whether that's a moment of reflection at the very least.
Yeah. And this is a part of the complication too, around being a person who is in a position where I am trying to encourage funders to step into or step more fully into the work of funding narrative specifically. And one of the things that often comes up is that people have started talking about this through the lens of quote unquote groups that are doing narrative, but they don't know they're doing narrative, which I find deeply offensive, actually, and quite paternalistic. But one of the things that I do think is really useful to consider is that regardless of whether or not a group is using the terminology of narrative, they still have some conceptual understanding of what it is that they're doing. So in some ways, the words that we use don't matter. It's the meaning that matters. And so how can we think about the ways that we are perhaps limiting what we're supporting because we're looking for a particular term, rather than actually having a depth of understanding about what it is that the work looks like, right? And so I'll give you kind of an example of this, because there's a group in India called Blank Noise Project that uses narrative interventions to get people to think and behave differently about women and safety. And one of the interventions that they use is about lifting up women and trans people's right to be defenseless. And one of the activities that they engage in is that they will go to a public park and take a nap in the open space, which is a way to encourage people to reconsider their ideas about gender, safety, bodily autonomy, power. And for the most part, over its 20-year history, Blank Noise has operated with little to no philanthropic funding. But it's a group that's playing a really key role in the Indian feminist movement and in the broader South Asian narrative ecosystem. But they don't use the term narrative, right? And it's not like they're rejecting the term or any of these kinds of things. It's just because for the context that they are in, that word doesn't make sense, right? But just because a context doesn't have a particular terminology that it's applying, A, that doesn't mean it needs to apply that terminology. And B, what that means is that it's then on the onus of someone who's working in philanthropy to actually understand the work and to engage in the contextual ways that make sense for where it is that they're funding.
Yeah, I think that's important to lift up, Mandy, too, because I think that is another thing when something becomes popularized, that everyone's looking for a certain framework, right, that they deem to be the framework for this work, which again is why it's so important to listen to and be kind of embedded in supporting movements. I think one of the things I was reading last week that I appreciated was the Omidyar Network, put out an article about their narrative change work around reimagining capitalism. And it was just like an interesting how they talked about the work. And one of the things they said that I thought was really refreshing was they come with an assumption that many of their grants have narrative impact. So even whether they're calling it that or not, and whether it's an obvious strategy, so they're like, yes, we fund mass campaigns and, or, documentary films as a part of it, and that's like very clear, but here's all these other things. And so instead of saying like, prove that you're doing narrative work, right? I don't know if this is actually what they meant, but that's how I took it, that you come in with the assumption that if you are embedded in movements, if you're doing this work, that part of that work is changing the story about what people believe, because that's important for achieving social change.
So there's one thing I really want to pull out from what's been said, which is the role of investment in the different components of an ecosystem in order for it to be able to flourish, right? And you've spoken about all the potential pitfalls of doing that in a co-optive or a top-down way. But I think that there's a few kind of components that we haven't named necessarily in terms of like the platforms on which narratives are given, like literally airtime sometimes, but also just like being centered and being present. The time you mentioned about the time and space that are needed for this kind of work and reflection and communication and being in relationship that leads to these narratives and the evolution of these narratives. You've mentioned a few things that cost resources, and you mentioned it's not just money, and I agree with you. I want to highlight a big risk, which is that whilst you said that narrative change can't be engineered and philanthropy shouldn't try, and I agree, I do think that actually narrative change is very heavily engineered by market-based interests and a lot of commercial investment in things like advertising and marketing and like things like that, as well as very heavily invested in by far-right agendas. So people who are trying to fund narrative change in a less progressive light, that are trying to shift the way that we think about things and the stories we have towards more kind of individualistic, more marginalized ways of viewing the world. So I see that as one huge risk of not investing in this work with a progressive philanthropic lens, because that money and resource and attention is actually already flowing into narrative change and narrative ecosystems. There are whole media sources and kind of spaces, and there's just so much that goes into that on more kind of right-leaning or kind of less progressive ways of thinking about narrative. So I see that as one risk of not investing in this if you're a philanthropist or a funder who's thinking about your role in this. What are some other risks of not funding this, right? You've spoken about the importance of doing it. You've spoken about some of the pitfalls of doing it wrong. But say you don't do this or you don't think about this. What are the problems? What are the stakes if we don't effectively invest in narrative ecosystems?
I mean, to be honest, I feel like we're seeing the impacts of this right now in the world, like the fact that narrative ecosystems are so under-resourced, the fact that movements are so under-resourced. And so I think that we're actually living that in many ways. We're seeing the rollback of human rights across the globe, and we can't deny the fact that part of this, and this is because anti-rights movements are well-resourced, well-coordinated, and part of this is their robust funding towards building narrative power. So I think we're seeing kind of what's happening, what some of those stakes are, right, unfold. And we've been seeing them unfold by not moving resources, not in all the ways that Mandy and I both spoke about, and not, supporting folks for long periods of time and not supporting them to be there. I think one of the things we often see is when a crisis hits, whether it's an economic crisis or a political crisis or a climate crisis, the right is there really quickly with a way to frame it and a way to tell the story. And we're not, because the funding is not sustained, or, work is happening whether funding is there or not. But I think that there is something to how kind of well-resourced those movements are and how they're able to kind of come in the long-term infrastructure building that it's had that we haven't had. So I guess I think we're going to continue. It's going to continue to kind of unroll in this way if we don't. So I would say that the stakes are quite high at the moment.
Yeah, and a quote that we put in the nonprofit quarterly article is from author and public intellectual Bayo Akomolafe, who said, "The times are urgent, let us slow down." And one of the reasons that I like this provocation is because we've been so conditioned into a way of operating that's motivated by crisis. And we often operate from a place of reactivity and comfort seeking when we're in that crisis mode. And what often then goes by the wayside is our ability to be grounded in a proactive vision of what we are building. And we forget that the reality is that the path to a new place can't be a replication of the path that we've been taking, because repeating those behaviors is what created the status quo today. And so if we continue to do them, we are simply leading ourselves to a continuation of the status quo. And so we've seen this over and over again in our histories, and we have really deep, sound intellectual traditions that have taught us that when we try to use the master's tools to build our house, we just build the master's house. So what I appreciate so much about Bayo Akomolafe's provocation in this piece is that he's naming the fact that we are and always have been in a time of paradox and in a time of contradiction. And so the path forward has to be one that allows us to grapple with these tensions in a deeply human way. So is it true that we're living in an unprecedented polycrisis? Or is it true that we're choosing to ignore the lessons that we might learn if we looked at history and seen the ways that there have been people living around the world in polycrisis for decades, for millennia, right? And so when it comes to philanthropy, we have to ask ourselves, is it true that resources are scarce in a sector where in the United States alone, private foundations at the end of 2023 held over $1.5 trillion? Or is it true that those who control that capital lack the moral imperative, political will, and liberatory vision to release it swiftly? To me, the answer is that both are true, right? And from my perspective, we would do better to move beyond this trap of zero-sum binary thinking where we get stuck in an either-or equation, despite the fact that we live in a both-and reality. And in this reality, we do have models and we do have guidance that we can follow that allow us to expand the liberatory practices in philanthropy. And there are people who know how to do it, who are actively doing it, and who are using a narrative lens of let's work together, because when we work together, there's enough for all of us, right? And so every single one of us who works within and who works adjacent to philanthropy has some power and agency to make different decisions about how we do our work. We all have some level of autonomy over our own behavior. And those are often the spaces where we begin to chart a new path toward the future that we long for and the future that we deserve. And if folks aren't sure where to begin, especially when it comes to resourcing narrative work, that's why me and Jody are here, right? Reach out to us. Reach out to people like Zainab Mohammed at the Katali Foundation, or Chiaro Cataneo at Elemental, or Dimple Abichandani. These are people who've been doing this work, who've been deeply embedded in both philanthropy and movement, who understand narrative and can be a guide. I think that there are many folks in the sector who feel really isolated. And in some ways, that's because we've been deliberately isolated as a tactic to stand in the way of this change. And so, in those circumstances, it makes sense to be fearful, to be cynical, to think that transformational systemic change is not possible or is going to take a lot of time. But that's because often people are thinking that they have to do it on their own. And like we said before, transformation of this kind is an inherently collective endeavor. No one individual, no one organization, or even no one movement is going to be able to durably transform beliefs and behavior at scale. But the same ways that folks are organizing to build things like regenerative economies and other systems of care and reciprocity, we also have to organize within philanthropy. And when we do that, then we're able to support collective formations that enable the types of change that we need to be nurtured and supported. And then we actually get to grow not just as technocratic workers in a financial industry, but as humans that are really deeply committed to making the best contributions that we can make to a just and joyful future, right? So these are things that I think we have a lot of opportunity in this moment. And sort of quote another philosophical figure, Malcolm X once said that the future belongs to people who prepare for it today. And while I think that it's true that we do need people to be responding to the crises of today, we also need people to be thinking 50 or 100 years into the future and living into that future in their behavior right now.
Wow.
I love that, Mandy. I mean, I think one of the bodies of work that we're working on right now with our collective practice and a number of other folks across the ecosystem is around girls' world building and dreaming, and looking at how, girls are resisting, they are creating, they are kind of holding a line, they are transforming so much in their communities, and they're also dreaming and imagining different realities and practicing living into them. And I think that's some of what's so powerful about girls and young people and the way, like, what they bring to organizing. So when you just said that last part, it made me think about that, and what the world would look like if everyone had those spaces to collectively reimagine what's possible and then work backwards towards living into that. It's really beautiful.
Yeah. And if you're interested in hearing more about concepts like that, you can listen to the episode we did recently on imagination infrastructure, Cassie Robinson, where we delved a bit deeper into the space to dream aspect of creating systems change.
Absolutely. That word has been coming up a lot for me, imagination, in all of this. And even also the word of myths and the world of narrative work opens up so much, even individual mindset work, because collective narratives in their most intimate manifestations are how we even think, are the actions we take, how we dream, and what we think about in the quiet moments of our lives. And that really does change how the world works. Wow. I mean, we really could talk to you all day. I wish we could, and we're going to have to set that up sometime, because this is absolutely fascinating and revolutionary work. Unfortunately for time, we do have to wrap it up, but I just want to say thank you both so much for the work that you're doing and that you've written, that you're facilitating in so many different contexts, but the way that you're bringing, elevating this kind of conceptual framework, as we say, to us, to the world, to the sector, and all of the incredible people and collaborators that you mentioned as well. So thank you so much for your time, and listeners, we'll post as well links to the articles and kind of resources, so that if you're interested in learning more about this work, you can access that easily. And other than that, just a big, big thank you from both of us.
Awesome. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in, and hope you loved the conversation.
As always, we'd love to connect with you. You can find us on LinkedIn as IG Advisors. Our website is impactandgrowth.com, and you can also check out our Fix the Flow Fellowship Program at fixtheflow.org.
Finally, of course, another thank you to our official sponsor, Siegel Family Foundation, for making this all possible, and to our media partner, Alliance Magazine. Don't forget, the code WhatDonorsWant, all one word, will get you 50% off an Alliance subscription. Thanks again for listening. See you soon.
This podcast was produced by me, Rachel Stephenson-Sheff, and the team at Scrubcast. Shout out to Dave and Tim. Please rate, review, and subscribe if you can. It really helps us do what we do. Thanks so much.